book people. Today I am doing my July wrap up. I ended up reading 10 books in June and I'm going to talk about them today. So I did have some reading goals for this month that I started with when I made my TBR video, and that was to finish the 3 book club books that I had for the month, as well as reading 2 other things that I picked with a TBR jar box. So I didn't quite hit every single goal. I ended up reading 2 book club books and then one of the books that the TBR jar gave me, and then the other ones were all just sort of like random picks. So I think that I did pretty well because usually I don't follow a TBR, so it was kind of like my first time really following a TBR, and I think that I was semi-successful just because I did end up finishing a lot of the books that I had on it, but I wasn't completely successful. So the first book I read was actually a book that I wanted to read in June, and I just did not end up getting to it in time. I actually ended up reading it throughout the end of June and then just finishing in July. So it's not that I didn't get to it in June so much as I just didn't finish it in June. And I really wanted to just say, okay, well, whatever, I'll talk about it in my June wrap-up video, but I held back just so that I could talk about it now, and I think that that was the right thing to do. But the first book that I read was Leather and Lark by Brynne Weaver. And I rated this a 3 stars. This was not what I wanted it to be. In my opinion, Butcher and Blackbird was so unique in what it achieved as a romance, but also as sort of like a mystery, thriller, horror. And I mean, it wasn't like the most well-written 5-star book ever, but it was something fresh and new, and I was expecting Leather and Lark to be at least somewhat similar to that. It seems to me that romance authors fall into this habit of starting a book series but only having like one really solid book in the series, which I believe for this one, because there is going to be another one, is Butcher and Blackbird. So there was no need to expand that universe into a series other than to just, give more content and write another romance. But this was sort of bordering on a lot more cringeworthy than the first one. I think that they're both sort of cringeworthy, but I liked Butcher and Blackbird. This was just not, a lot of it didn't make sense to me, and I think that some of the tendencies of the characters just seemed really out of place, and I just didn't understand why certain people did what they did. I also, and this is common knowledge, this is not a spoiler, Lark kills people, and I don't know why. Like, Sloane was a serial killer who killed people who did bad things. That made sense. Lark doesn't really have much of a reason. So it's just, it felt very like, well, I gotta keep with the murdering protagonists, so we're just gonna make Lark a murderer. And I didn't agree with that. I didn't think that it made sense. And I didn't find that the romance between Lark and Lachlan was particularly believable, and it left a lot of space for wanting more, which in my opinion is not really a great trait to have as a book. So I thought that some of the dialogue in this was just like really, really hard to get through, and some of the scenes in it just didn't work for me. So I read it and I gave it a try, and I will probably still read the 3rd one just because I am interested to see where that one goes, because I'm pretty sure that the female main character is supposed to be from like the circus. But I don't know. I don't think that I really like the Kane brothers enough to like be super invested in their romances, and Lark just didn't really, I don't know, she felt very like insert quirky girl. I didn't love it. But that's Leather and Lark. My second read for July was You Know What You Did, which was a Literally Dead book club pick, and I rated it a 4 stars. It was very good. I didn't really know what to expect going into it, and I didn't know what it was about, because with Literally Dead, if I haven't heard of the books before, I just kind of go into it blind and hope for the best, which has served me well in the past. I didn't know much about Night Watching, and then I read it and it was a 5 stars. So, I think that it's sometimes best to just go into things blind. You Know What You Did is a story about a woman whose mother has passed away, and there are just some weird sort of scary things happening around her, and she is spiraling, and this female main character actually has OCD, which I think is very, I myself do not have OCD, so I don't know if I am speaking necessarily correctly on this, but in my opinion, the OCD was very well represented in it, and it did add an interesting layer to the story. But my only problem with this book was that I guessed the central mystery. I, by the end of it, knew exactly what was going to happen. So by the end, it felt a little bit formulaic, but up until that point, I thought that it was really, really unique. A lot of the things that were happening in it just felt sort of like, I've never read anything like this before. I feel like I say that a lot about what I read, but maybe that's just because I'm kind of trying new things all the time. But it really was something that I had never read before, and I thought that it was very well put together, and the mystery was really interesting. I think that if I were reading it, having not read as many mysteries as I have, it would have probably been a little bit better, and I think I may not have guessed it as well as I did. But yeah, it was very, very enjoyable, and it would have been a 5 stars if I hadn't guessed the ending. So I think that it is a 5-star in spirit. But it was really fantastic. The next book is Wild Love by Elsie Silver. This pained me. And I'm not going to go in depth on this one because I did make a reading vlog about it. So if you're interested to hear my thoughts and opinions, go watch that video. It is not spoiler free. So if you haven't read the book, maybe don't. But if you don't care, then go watch it. I will say, this is way too long. In my opinion, romance should not be over 250 pages. And this was over 250 pages. There was so much, like, just walking in circles and nothing happening, and then it becoming, like, a super formulaic romance where you could just guess everything that was going to happen. Like, I could predict every single beat that it needed to hit. It was not a very enjoyable experience. I was kind of with it for the first 200 pages, and then past that, I was bored, and I couldn't really find a reason to really want to read it. I can't believe I finished it. I honestly can't. And somewhere in my reading vlog, I did say that I would probably continue with the series, but honestly, I just don't see that happening. I don't think I could put up with another book of this. It is one of those books where it hits a certain point, and it's just all smut, and I think that the smut in this was not well written, very uncreative, but trying to be creative, which is a very weird combination. And yeah, I just really didn't enjoy it. And I don't want to sound too harsh, like there are definitely some high points in it, and it definitely made me giggle. There were some great relationships in it, but for the most part, I just really didn't like it. So this was either 2 or 3 stars, I can't remember, but honestly, thinking about it now, I'm leaning towards a 2. All right, and the Literally Dead book club pick for July is Middle of the Night by Riley Sager. This is my first ever Riley Sager novel, and I have heard so much about his writing, and I have wanted to read one of his books for a long time. And personally, I think that this was a great introduction. I've heard other people talk about it and what they thought, and they said that it was extremely slow-paced and that they didn't really enjoy that aspect of it, but I thought that the pacing of this was one of the best parts. I loved how slow-moving it was. I feel like it gave me time to consider everything that was going on, and I really got like the full picture because of how the pacing was. This was a book that I sat down and read in a day. I consumed this so quickly, basically injected it into my brain, and I was surprised at the end. I could not guess who the perpetrator was of the crime, so I think that that was pretty fun. There were some really great moments of tension in this. I really liked the sort of cultish aspect to it. And I also have become somewhat of a sucker for dual timelines where you're sort of like going back in time with the characters before a certain event happens and then going into the future and seeing the fallout of it and trying to sort of solve what happened. So I thought that this was just like the perfect mix of things for me. And it reminded me a little bit of Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, and also of It when it goes back to the time when they were kids. And I think that this is a really, really well-rounded novel. And I don't know, from what I hear about people and them disliking Riley Sager, this is one that I've heard just sort of stands out from his other work, but I also can't speak to that because I haven't read his other work. But yeah, I was very, very pleasantly surprised with this one, and I would really like to pick up another one of his books sometime soon. And I think I rated this a 4 stars. This next book was so much fun, and I ended up reading this and then buying the other 2 in the series and basically consuming them all within like days. And that is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This is the Regency Fairy Tale series, and I read all 3 last month. And it is, at least this first book, is about this girl named Dora, and her cousin are going to London for the season, trying to find husbands, but Dora when she was younger, was like attacked sort of by a fairy, and that fairy took half of her soul. So she can't really feel emotions like the average person can, and tends to sort of have a lot of missteps where she says things she shouldn't and does things she shouldn't because she just is not aware that it isn't what is considered normal. And so it goes from there. And her cousin Vanessa, who is participating in the season and trying to marry, is trying to help her find a person who can help her get the other half of her soul back. So the characters in this are so much fun. I thought the romance in this was some of the sweetest romance I've ever read in my entire life. I was giggling and kicking my feet reading this. I thought that the fact that the romance was so slow paced and that there was no smut really, really enhanced things for me. This was such a slow moving romance in the best way. And honestly, I think that this is how I prefer my romance. It wasn't even necessarily a bunch of like yearning and tension. There was tension, but it was very sweet, and I loved the development of the main relationship in this book. And I will say that the sort of like magic and the fairies and just the whole sort of like magical element is a little bit underdeveloped, but I don't think it's just not the point of the book. So if you're going into this looking for a fantasy, I think you might be a little disappointed, but I don't know. I think that everything else kind of makes up for it. And if you're willing to sort of overlook the fact that some of the magic stuff doesn't really make sense, it's really good. But this was a 5 stars. I read it in a day. I pretty much read it in one sitting and immediately went and bought the other ones. In between reading Half a Soul and the second book in the series, I read Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White. I was book shopping while I was away at my grandma's because I was like, I'm gonna go to my grandma's to read. And I was there for a week and I forgot my books. So I had to go and buy some new ones. And this was one that I picked up. I'd had my eye on it for a little while and I've heard people talk about it, but I'm really, really glad that I picked this up. It is a story about a trans boy named Benji who is living in this sort of like dystopian apocalyptic world, and he is running from a religious cult who has sort of turned him into this, as the Bat calls him, a bioweapon. And he has a run-in with this LGBTQ plus like teenager, young adult like club. I think club might be the wrong word, but they are a group of sort of like young adults that are LGBT inclusive and also fighting back against this religious cult. So it sort of kicks off from there and you meet all these different characters, and it's very, very gruesome, very gory, but it touches on a lot of really important things. And, you know, reading this, I can understand how important this is for those of the LGBTQ plus community to read. And I could really see how this representation could positively impact people who are reading it. And I thought that it was just a very touching thing to read at some points. And I love the idea of knowing that something like this exists out there for people to feel included when they read. But yeah, the characters in this were so much fun. I loved Benji as a character, and the grotesque nature of what was going on was so much fun. I love a good gory book. And I was very surprised that this is considered YA, but I don't think I even know what constitutes as YA, because there's a lot of swearing in this. There's like allusions to a sort of like sex scene, I guess. Not really, but like kind of. There's a bunch of gore. So I don't really know what constitutes as young adult, but I was kind of surprised that this was in the young adult section. I feel like this could be an adult book. But yeah, and I read this in pretty much 24 hours as well. I was sitting on my grandma's couch just absolutely consuming, like devouring books. It was wonderful. But this, I think, was like perfectly timed. I read it exactly when I needed something like this, because it did cut away from all of the romance that I was reading and just bring me into something so completely fresh. And I don't read a whole lot of like dystopian stuff. So this was really great, and I think I rated it a 4 stars. And now, 10,000 Stitches by Olivia Atwater. I also rated this a 5 stars, and I am torn between deciding if this or Half a Soul were my favorite in the series. This is a very loose Cinderella retelling, and I say very, very loose because it definitely has the sort of similar events as like Cinderella, but it definitely takes off in its own direction. I know that Lexi Newly Nova read these 3, and said that this was the most whimsical of the three, and I gotta say, I think I agree with that. Lord Blackthorn just brings a whole new level of whimsy when you read this, and I thought that his character was so much fun. I love that he sort of like caused trouble, but it was like entirely accidental, and he just thought that he was doing the right thing, and I really, really like characters like that. And I thought that the romance in this, although a little bit less noticeable, it's not as much of like a high point in this book, it was very sweet as well, and I thought that it was very touching. And I also really enjoyed the sort of magical binding of like our character Effie and like her agreement with Lord Blackthorn. I really liked the way that that was sort of written and how she had to stitch his jacket. The magic in this, again, kind of underdeveloped, not necessarily the like main point of the book, but still really fun, and I think that the magic in this one was probably my favorite in all three of the books. Next, I read the second book in A Good Girl's Guide to Murder series. I read Good Girl, Bad Blood, and I thought that the mystery in this one was really, really fun. I had such a hard time guessing things. There was like one person that I assumed had something to do with the mystery, and I was right about that, but I didn't know what I was right about. I just knew that it was that person. And I think that I just love Pip as a narrator. Is just really, really fun and really sweet. And I love being inside her head. I think that it's a lot of fun. And I have noticed as I'm reading the third one right now, Pip kind of just starts to devolve, and seeing those changes within her and seeing the way that she interacts with the people around her is a really, really, I would say, touching thing to see, because in her struggle, she always has a really good support system around her, and I think that that is a great thing to see in books like this. So I thought that the mystery was really great, and there's always so many twists and turns in Holly Jackson books, as far as I know, so I had a really good time with it. Last but not least, in the Regency Fairy Tale series, I read Long Shadow. This, in my opinion, was the weakest of the three, but I think had my favorite romance of the three. This is about a character named Abigail, who is the adoptive daughter of the main love interest in the first book, Half a Soul. And there is this mystery sort of sickness going on where a bunch of girls are dying, and Abigail has to team up with this mystery woman named Mercy to try and figure out what is going on. And it's a sapphic romance, and there is a little twist at the end that I felt like I saw it coming, but at the same time, I couldn't really put into words what I saw coming, just that I saw some sort of twist. This one took me the longest to get through, but I still enjoyed it. I would pretty much read anything that Olivia Atwater writes. It's my plan to go and find if she's written anything else and, inject it directly into my brain. But this one was a little bit of a drag for me at some points. It just got a little bit slow and there wasn't a whole lot going on. And again, that same sort of underdeveloped magic system just really did not support this novel very well, in my opinion. But otherwise, I thought that, the characters are always very sharp and the dialogue is great. So there were a lot of things that made up for what I felt like was lacking in this book, but there were still things lacking that I couldn't necessarily ignore. So this was a 4 stars, not a 5, but still amazing, and I still loved it. And finally, Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is my second R.F. Kuang book, and I loved it so much. This was just so good. I actually cannot stop thinking about it. This inspired me to start writing a novel that I'd been thinking about for a little while, which is a little weird considering what it's about. But this just gave me that spark of inspiration that only certain books can. It is about 2 authors that sort of like grow up running in the same circles, except one of them ends up becoming very, very popular and very famous, and her name is Athena. And then you have the not so popular one named June. And one night, June and Athena are just sort of kicking it at Athena's house, and Athena ends up dying in front of June. And of course, like any person would do, June steals Athena's new manuscript and edits and publishes it herself under her name. So it's one of those books that, although is very sort of like comical in certain ways, and also incredibly frustrating, the narration by June in this is like disgusting. She is the type of unreliable narrator that like makes you hate reading but also love it at the same time, because you're like, this is so good, but also I cannot believe I am reading this with my eyeballs. It's so awful. But it touches on a lot of very interesting conversations about, plagiarism and racism. And it sparked a lot of questions in me about what makes something truly original and what is actually considered stealing. Because June has a lot of arguments as to why the book is actually hers. And although you're not necessarily set up to agree with June, there are definitely some questions posed that make you wonder. So I thought that this was really sharp, and it took me a very short amount of time to read, unlike Babel, which took me a very long time to read. And I don't know, this seems like a shift in tone for R.F. Kuang as far as I know. I mean, I think that the Poppy War is leaning towards a more serious style, whereas Yellowface is very reading I don't know, a Twitter feed or something. But yeah, this was a great way to end off the month, and I'm super happy I read it. And this was part of my TBR jar prompt, so I did actually fulfill that prompt by reading this. So that is all the books that I read in July. I did have a couple other things that I wanted to read. I was supposed to read Snow Crash for a theoretical book club, but I decided that I wanted to buddy read that with my significant other instead because he was interested in it, so I kind of just put that one on the shelf. And I was also supposed to read the library at Mount Char, the library on Mount Char, which I started, but it was such a drag for me to start that I could not finish it. I am going to continue reading it. It's just one that I think I need to take a little bit more time with. And I also started reading The Naturals by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, which I am part of the way through right now. So I've got a couple things on the go. It's probably going to be another great reading month, but I definitely didn't hit every single goal that I wanted to this month. But that's okay, because I still did a whole lot of reading. This is probably one of my most fruitful reading months, other than January, which I think I also read 10 books in. And I read a pretty good variety as well. Quite a bit of romance, but also just a lot of good variety anyway. So that is all that I have for this video. If you want to see more of me, I have my Instagram and Goodreads linked in the caption at all times. And I hope that you join me again in my next video. Thank you for watching. Bye!